torrential downpour, kann ich denken nirgends, kann ich aufstehen, kann ich legen,
Stay in the air-conditioned room. That's what you can do.
Das ist, jetzt ich verstehe den Ganzen, was du hast gesagt.
Chavre, good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Terumais Pei Gimel Halacha Hey, and God willing, we will be starting today the new fourth chapter Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Lev, Daf Lamed Beis. We left off 4 lines from the top by the new Mishnah, by the final Mishnah of this Pedic. It's the final Daf of this Pedic, and it's going to be a very interesting topic. The Mishnah will discuss what will be the status of Trumais and Maisrais that are designated by a Goy, by a non-Jew. Now, really, the discussion of our Mishnah can only be premised on 2 important discussions in which each one has a machlekes. Let me just quickly introduce them and review them. Number 1, there's a machlekes tanoi, whether yesh kinyan la'akum lahafkia or ein kinyan la'akum lahafkia, etc., which means that according to some tanoim, when a non-Jew legally owns a chelik, a portion of land in the Holy Land, vis-a-vis the laws of Trumais u'maisras, the kedusha of that area is diminished to the point that produce that grows from there, bechlal, certainly biblically, is not obligated in Trumas u'maisras. Our Mishnah's discussion has to be premised on the other Tanoim who hold that ein kinyan la'akum lahafkia, that the ownership of a goy does not diminish the kedusha to the point where there is no longer a biblical obligation. There is a biblical obligation. Now hold on. Even though produce that grows from the Holy Land has to be tithed, in other words, there is an obligation on the produce, a non-Jew is obligated to keep the Shava mitzvahs b'nei Noach. They're not obligated to tithe. That, for sure, there is no chiyuv on them. However, the question will be, what were to happen if they did do the separation? B'chlal, the discussion of why would a non-Jew keep a mitzvah, this really is properly discussed. We learned at Rambam that at the end in Hilchas Malachim, I forgot on what Pedic, but towards the end, when the Rambam speaks about, or right before he speaks about the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, the Rambam has the broadest opinion concerning non-Jews and mitzvahs. Lokula Alma, a non-Jew is not allowed to keep Shabbos, nor allowed to learn Torah other than the Torah that's shaykh to his Sheva Mitzvahs, and for that he's chayev misa. Goy Shabbos is chayev mitzvah. A goy that learns Torah is chayev misa. The Rambam actually holds, right, that if a goy says that he wants to keep a mitzvah, he's opting in keeping a mitzvah, not because he's doing a giyur. We're not talking about a ger toshav, we're not talking about a ger tzedek. He wants to keep kosher. The Rambam actually writes that he gets some reward for it. Not everyone agrees with the Rambam. The Rambam generally stands alone. He's a great man. Even if a goy would not get schar of doing here trumas u'maisers, even if you won't follow the sheet of the Rambam, there is a commercial benefit, theoretical commercial benefit for a non-Jew to separate trumas u'maisers, again, predicated on the fact that produce that grows in Eretz Yisrael has to be tithed at some point. So if his market are Jewish customers, if he wants to sell to Yidden, it's definitely until today. When me and you go to the Holy Land and we go to the market, most of us, we would prefer to buy produce that's already tithed. Especially we're not from, it's not a big deal to do it. It's a mitzvah. It's a great deal to do it. But still, people want to get something, we're lazy. You want to buy it and you want to eat it. So just for that, a guy can say, I'm not chayiv. I'm not looking to get a mitzvah. Even if you don't subscribe to the sheet of the Rambam, a guy could actually separate trumas u'maisers. There's one other topic that we have to talk about, and that is that there are many who hold that if the ownership of the goy wasn't only when he grew the produce, but he owned it when the miruach was done, in other words, when whatever the gemar malacha is for that product, many hold that if it was under a non-Jewish ownership at that time, that product never has to be tithed. That's not the sheet of our Mishnah. Again, our Mishnah, we're going to read this inside the Rashirilio. In other words, there are many things, these 2 primary arguments that we have to just acknowledge and say that our Mishnah is only following those who hold that ein kinyan la'akum lavkia. The item has to be tithed. Furthermore, even though he owns it during the miruach, there's still a chiyuv on the chefza. The goy is vaday not mechoyev on the gavra. whether you're going to follow the Rambam that he's doing it l'shem mitzvah, or whether he's doing it only for commercial purposes, the Mishnah now, let's come back to our Mishnah, will it be effective or will it not be effective? And it's going to be a fascinating Mishnah. The Mishnah will also specify one halacha concerning produce, and that is the halacha of neter revoi, unlike Arla. That is noyeg, bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. This is important. Neter revoi is only noyeg in Eretz Yisrael. And we'll see in the Mishnah that there is a general question whether the goy's separation of trumas or maasros, whether it's effective or not effective. And independent of that, there is another machlokes in the Mishnah regarding if what is the status of neter revoi if the goy chooses to establish produce as neter revoi. Will it be bound to the laws of neter revoi, which would mean that you can only consume it in Yerushalmi HaKodesh, or not? Or I don't care what his intention is. There's no revoi by a non-Jew. We'll see why revoi might. That will be the two big topics. The most fascinating part of the Mishnah will be a sheet of Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, that mitzad echad he holds that a goy is able to imbue produce with the kedusha of truma. It's effective. Nevertheless, the status of a truma of a non-Jew has a lesser kedusha than the status of a truma of a Jew, and there are two halachic nafkaminas because of this lesser of a status. That's going to be unbelievable. This really is the whole daf today. Now, there's going to be a lot of nuance. I just want to say that we're going to learn three different cases in the Gemara that the Gemara brings from a Braisa, in which there's a machlokes Tanoi, Rabbi and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Aside of the topic of our Mishnah, it's going to further it. Let's go according to those who hold that if a goy chooses, for whatever reason, to separate truma, his separation is effective. So that item is truma. The remaining is not tevel, it's mesukin from tevel. And if he separates ma'aser edition, the same. Okay, now the non-Jew gives this truma to a kohen. What's the status of his ne'emanus? Can the kohen simply eat it? Or do we have to be afraid, will be the sheet of Rabbi, that just from his ignorance, maybe what he gave is a mixture of truma and tevel, and I'll explain to you why that might happen. And therefore, we have to be chayish. A non-kohen cannot eat it because it could be its truma. The kohen himself can also not eat it. It might be tevel, and again, the solution that will always be to be toidim uma'asim and markamached, as we'll speak. There'll be three such cases in the Gemara. That will be more or less. That's more or less the whole Daf Lamed Beis until the end of the Perek. And again, if we'll have time, I would like to start today the fourth chapter, Siyam and Haskalah. We did quote the Mishnah, the first Mishnah of the first chapter, a couple of daf ago. The Mishnah is going to be speak also fascinating, a scenario where, like we mentioned, midrabanan, you're supposed to give, let's go with the average 2% of truma. What were to happen, Aviv, if someone, for whatever reason, when they separated truma, they did not separate the full amount, but they intended to do so in the future? In other words, I'll repeat this with more detail. I have 100 saw. For whatever reason, I'm separating one saw instead of two. But when I separate the one saw, I'm already intending that tomorrow I'll separate the other. When tomorrow comes and I separate the other, there might be a dilemma. What might be the dilemma? Very simple. I had 100. When I separated one, with the kavan of doing it properly, means I will separate 2%. Now I only separated 1%. What might happen? That 1% might have been misaken half of the pile. Half of the pile is misukan, half of the pile is tevel. When I'm going to go tomorrow to separate the other saw, maybe when I take the other saw, who says I'm taking it mehatevel shaboy, which would be good, maybe I'm going to be chopping from the mesukan shaboy. Something that's exempted cannot be used to be misaken something that's mechuyev. You can only separate truma from tevel. Do we say it's problematic or not? In the Mishnah, there's going to be two opinions, and Daf Lamed Daled will have the third opinion. Anyways, that will be the opening shot of the fourth chapter. But
that's a scenario where he didn't designate it like north and south, but then take it from the other direction.
That's a scenario where he physically removed it. Rabbi Mendel, very good. Because if he would have made an oral declaration, according to those who say he has to be Messiah Makim, then the solution will be to take the second saw from the side, and even there it's a problem.
Doesn't go like the.
Actually, I take that back. In other words, Let's jump back on that when we learn inside. Very good. So that's why I mentioned that if the person removed one saw and his intent then was that's the end of it, even though he should have taken 2%, but since biblically taking a drop is enough, and even rabbinically, if you take one kernel, post facto, it's separated. Once it's already effective, aviv, then everything is mesukah, and then you cannot add. But if a person from the outside had in mind, I'm going to do it properly, I'm taking off 2 saw. For whatever reason, let's say I'm in a rush. I'm in a mamash in a rush, and I have a utensil that has 1 saw size in it. So I fill it up, and I was going to do it twice, and before I did it the second time, I'm running out. So if I intended from the outset to take off 2 saw, then I have to take off both saw. It's not, the whole thing is not fixed unless I took off the 2 saw. The question is, from where do you take it? Gavaldik. Let's come back. Chevra. Daf Lamed Beis, Daf Leiv. So many nuances. Another detail, and we know this, it's good to review it. This we have throughout Chazal, that when Sancheriv exiled the 10 tribes, and he brought into the Holy Land a nation that we call them the Kutim, or later the Shoimroinim, and they ultimately, because of a phenomena that's not natural, which was that wild animals, that beteva, don't go into human habitat. Lions don't come into big cities. They don't do that. Lions were going into the cities in which they were settled, and they were snatching and eating people. And they understood, they interpreted it, that's because they're living in the Holy Land, and they're not serving Hashem Echad. So from the fear of the lions, they converted. It's called Geirei Aroyos. Aroyos, not with an ayin, with an aleph from a lion. Ultimately, we discovered that they never really abandoned their idol worship. But there were periods of time in which there was a debate whether they are real converts or not. Why yeah, why no? Because if someone converts out of fear, that means it's not purely l'shem shamayim, but they went under the water, or a man had a bris milah and he went under the mikvah, and he had in mind to be makabel the mitzvahs. And when there's a mizbeach standing and they brought karbanis, is that effective or not effective? Our Mishnah follows those who hold that their conversion was not effective. Okay? On the side. Nowadays, even though many, I'm not saying all, many people come into a beis din wanting to convert, it's called Geirei Ishus, which means that they met, unfortunately, a non-Jewish partner, a Jewish partner, the non-Jew met a Jewish partner, and they understand from whoever that they have to convert, or they want to convert, they want to be better accepted. That's also not l'shem shamayim. We don't compare it to the case of the Kutim. Why? Because up until 100 years ago, or maybe a bit more, when people came to convert, the conversion process was very quick. So the intent you have when you walk into beis din, that's the intent you have, the presumed intent when you go under the water. Nowadays, all of the fruma batei dinim, everywhere, will have someone in their program for an extended period of time. 2 years, 1 year, at least 6 months, whatever that is. So we say that during that time, since they are going to be living a observant lifestyle, even if what caused them to walk into beis din was something other than the pursuit of the truth, we're going to say that by the time they actually were makabel the mitzvahs, they're doing it because they believe in it, because they believe this is the emes. This is why today batei dinim don't send away Geirei Ishus. Adarabah, if someone comes into beis din and they're dishonest why they're there, that would be a much bigger reason for beis din now to say, you were not honest with us, because we want to have honesty. But if the person says, I'm coming here because I met a Jew, and I want to convert to become like them, right? It's going to take them here in LA, it's going to take them 2 years. By the time that happens, they're doing it l'shem shamayim. That's the presumption. Okay, coming back. So our Mishnah holds that a kuti, I'm just saying that, has a din of a goy. So v'hanokri v'hakuti is really the same. And like we already spoke out in the introduction, they went ahead and they separated truma. They separated truma after the meruach. So ein kinyan la'akum la'afkiya, that means that their produce is obligated to be tithed. Number 2, the fact that they owned it during the meruach also does not exempt the product from being tithed. It's a product that has to be tithed biblically. So if the guy would do nothing, the guy would grow it, package it, and sell it, Okay, then the Jew would be chayiv to separate trumas from meiser midoiraisa. But the goy did it. The kuti did it. Says our Mishnah, trumas and truma umasreis and meiser. Gavaldik. Now look inside the Rashirilio, just to read inside everything that we spoke out by heart. The Rashirilio on the right column, around 5 lines from the top in the beginning by the Mishnah. Trumas and truma im tarma mishulahem. So there's 2 dinim. Number 1 is the truma is holy. It's truma midoiraisa, and therefore it's asura lezarim. And number 2, guys, that the remaining product is not tevel. Second Amevi over there, Masechtas Gitin, and Rashi over there, we have a Rishonim. It says regarding our Mishnah, the Kusavar Hai Tana Ein King in Legoibe Eretz Yisrael. It's called Lahafkia Mina Maisris. That's the total expression. Koloimer, that when the goy grows it, we don't say that his ownership in the Holy Land diminishes the Kedusha, and therefore produce is like produce that grows Michus La'aretz. We don't. Our Tana does not say that. And therefore, the peiros is tevel midorais, and therefore, in other words, if the product would not be tevel, then how can it be truma? No, it's tevel, and therefore, when he separates it, it's truma. Okay, and then he brings from the Tosfos, and I'm just going to say by heart because I really want to finish today's daf and go into the next chapter. And tomorrow we go back to learning 6:15 the normal time. That another din that don't our Mishnah is speaking not only if a Jew grew it. And a Jew owned it up until the Meruach. And for some reason, he sold it to a goy. And then the goy separated it, and then the goy gave it. No, even if the goy owned not only the land, but he did everything up until and including the Meruach. Even though others would have held, there are other Tanoim that would hold that there's no chiyuv again. That's not our Mishnah. No, it's the Mishnah's din is predicated that this produce, even in the case where it was land owned by a goy, where it was brought to the time of obligation, and the meruach happened while it was still under the ownership of a goy, our Tana holds that the product objectively is tevel midoiraisa. It has to be tithed midoiraisa, and that's the topic of our Mishnah. Will the goy's separation be effective or not effective? Our Tana holds it's effective. Trumas truma. Meiser is Meiser, and you know why that's so? Because really, Trumas or Meisers could be viewed as an extension of Hegdish. There is a Kedusha, especially in Truma. So the bigger question is, can a non-Jew consecrate an animal for a korban? The answer is yes, absolutely. Right? Ki beisi, beis tefillah l'chol ha'amim. With details, but a goy now, how many karbanis, what type of karbanis, we know the Rambam Shita Sarama Machlekes Rishonim, but generally says the Mishnah the Hegdesham Hegdesh. By the way, Vadai that for Bedek Habayis is a Hegdesh. A Hegdesh, I'm saying that a goy can designate an animal to be a korban, and that animal will have the kedusha of a korban. So just like a non-Jew is able to imbue a chulin animal with the kedusha, imagine of kedushas mizbeach. Right, the whole story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa. Whoever that Keser was, he sent a korban to be brought in the Beis Hamikdash. Right, and there was an issue with the blemish, but otherwise there would be no issue with of bringing it. So Gavaldik. So that's number 1. So says the Mishnah. It's a full-fledged truma. Now we're going to speak about one agricultural law in which we have a machloikis, like we spoke on in the introduction. Orla, which applies to all fruits, which applies whether they grew in the Holy Land or not, is a din that the product, if the tree that's within its halachic 3 years from when it was planted, if it produces fruits, those fruits are prohibited even to have benefit from. It's asur bahana. In Eretz Yisrael, Dafke, there is an extension of that, and that is that in its halachic 4th year, you have to know how to count those years, not negaya right now. In its halachic 4th year, the produce has a certain level of kedusha, not asur bahana, but it's very similar to meiser sheni, which would be that it has to be consumed only in Yerushalmi HaKodesh. There is a machloikis whether this is only a halacha for grapes, for a vineyard, and therefore many will always have the girsa of kerem rivoi. Let's go with the Rambam. The Rambam says that the din of the 4th year isn't only for a vineyard, it's a din for all trees, and that's why he calls it netaravoy. I'm just saying that because in our Mishnah we have the word kerem. It's not just in our Mishnah. And some people will be goydis netarevoi, or they will understand that kedem is just a mashal, but that's not negate to our Mishnah. We want to know, we're coming back, this daf is about the non-Jew. Rabbi Yehuda says, in other words, he agrees with the Tanakama when it comes to Truma. The goy can be toidim. Vada, he can be ma'aser, there's no kedusha, but ein lenochri kedem revoi. But there's no din of kedem revoi by a goy. Now, I want you to know that there are many. First of all, I take back what I just said. There are many ways of understanding Rabbi Yehuda. One of the ways, let's just follow one way. If not, it's going to get confusing. If you remember the machlekes that we have of yesh king or ein king and la'akum, it was 2 against 2. Rabbi Yehuda was one of the 2 that holds that yesh king and la'akum lahafkiya midei maestros. In other words, he holds that there is a diminished level of kedusha in land that belongs to a goy in the Holy Land, to the point that biblically you don't have to tithe anything. Now, don't forget that Arla is noyeg bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. So even Lashitas Rabbi Yehuda and the others that are on his side, that non-Jewish ownership diminishes the holiness of the land. Okay, so let's go to the biggest extreme. So it makes it like chutz la'aretz. Okay, Arla is noyeg b'chutz la'aretz. So Arla will be noig regardless. But net aravoy or kerem ravoy, which is a din exclusive to the product of the Holy Land, Rabbi Yehuda l'shitasi that holds that non-Jewish ownership takes away kedushas haaretz until when a Jew repurchases it. So therefore, ein lenachri kerem ravoy. Let's go with that understanding. And the chachamim who hold that ein kinyan la'akum la'afkiya. So there is a kedusha. If there is a kedusha, again, yesh loi. Now, again, that means a goy doesn't have to eat it in Yerushalmi. A goy does not have to keep the mitzvahs. What it does mean is that even though the land was owned by a goy, that the product was brought to its completion under non-Jewish ownership, the obligation, not on the gavra, on the product, that it can only be consumed in Yerushalayim, l'chachamim is still there. So the goy can eat non-kosher. The goy is not bound by mitzvahs, by these mitzvahs. He's not bound by the tayag mitzvahs. But a Jew is obligated to adhere to the laws of kerem revoi or net revoi, even though it was owned by a non-Jew. Okay. Net revoi only applies in Eretz Yisrael. And now we're going to go back to the opening Trumas U'Maisres, the general Trumas U'Maisres. And even regarding that, there is a machlokes tanoi. Our Mishnah does not bring anyone that says that the goy's truma is ineffective. That we won't have in our Mishnah. What we will have in our Mishnah is a very interesting opinion. And let's go back to something that we have learned already 2 times in this Masechta. When we remember by Yitraim, Truma v'yachzer v'yitraim. That's where we spoke it out the first time. And we said the following, that whenever you have, up until now we said, Truma midrabanan, the nafkamina between Truma d'oraisa and Truma d'Rabbanan will be, number 1, that the need of having a ratio of 100 against 1 to be mevatel Truma, which is a din d'Rabbanan, is only if the Truma is a Truma d'oraisa. So we already learned before that there are times that Truma is Truma, but it's going to be batal b'roif. Also, if a non-kohen ate truma, the rule is that not only does that person have to pay back the value of the truma, but there is a penalty that he has to add a choimish. We don't always say that. If there is a truma that's not biblical truma, it's not medamas, and there's no choimish. And that's going to be this topic now by the non-Jew separation. So the Tanakama holds, the hemshuk to the Tanakama, that not only is hanachri vakuti trumasam truma, not only that, but it's real truma. It's biblical truma. And therefore, if that truma gets mixed with other product, if you don't have the ratio, it's a big ratio of 100 to 1, trumas hanachri will affect the midamas. And or if someone eats that truma, not only do they have to compensate the value of the truma, but they're chayev, as it says in the Torah, to also add a halachic fifth. But regarding, however, Rab Shimon, now is Rab Shimon referring only to the chaimish or also to the damas? It's not clear in the Mishnah. right? The word poited, I want you to know, the word poited is not shayach for the midamas. Midamas or ene midamas, right? The word patur is by financial, chayiv or not chayiv. So explicitly, Rab Shimon l'chu'ur is referring to the chaimish. We'll see more in the Gemara. Rab Shimon says no, that you're patur. Now, what does that mean? We don't know yet. It can mean two things. It can either mean that Rab Shimon holds that it's only truma midrabanan. That's very problematic. That would be that's not what he holds. It would be very problematic because you got a problem. Tevel is an obligation midoiraisa. When the Mishnah opens up that the Nachri, V'Hakuti, that they separate Truma, their Truma's Truma, there are two consequences. Number one is, does this have the Kedusha of Truma? Could a non-Kohen eat it? Here I can say, yeah, Midrabanan, a non-Kohen cannot eat it. But there's another consequence, and that is that if this Truma is Truma, then the remaining product is no longer Tevel. That means that Yisrael, concerning, as far as Truma is concerned, can eat it. If Truma is not effective midoiraisa, it cannot take away the status of Tevel. And indeed, Rab Shimon is not saying that it's Truma midrabanan. It's an interesting concept, that even though it's a Truma midoiraisa, but it's not as strong as a regular Truma. It's amazing. It's mesakin the Tevel. A non-Kohen cannot eat it. And nevertheless, we don't apply the general dinim of Truma explicitly by a chaimish, and I'll tell you right now, and really we have a tradition that Rab Shimon also said it regarding Dimuah, that this Truma does not need the ratio midrabanan of 100-1, suffices the biblical ratio of roiv. All right. Now, based on the din of our Mishnah.
Wait, Rabbi, well, you just said that it suffices for the biblical ratio. That's why he putters you from the chaimish. Is that what you're saying?
No. Well, yeah, they're linked. We had these two before when the Mishnah spoke about Truma midrabana. We had these two together in the Mishnah. What's after the Mishnah says that Truma v'yachzer v'yitraim, then the Mishnah itself says, and what's the difference between? Maybe that was by a suffix Truma doiraisa. I forgot which cases, but I know we had that by midrabanan. I'm making it clear it's not because Rab Shimon holds it's Truma midrabanan, but he holds that even in Truma doiraisa there are two levels of Truma. Okay. Now, like we mentioned, the Gemara will give us three scenarios based on the din of our Mishnah that the goy's Truma is Truma. Practical scenarios. Scenario number one. This is a braisa, guys. Hoitzi lohem Truma metoich beisai. The goy actually gave to the kohen his truma. In other words, he goes over to a kohen and he tells him, Rab Kohen, this is truma. So what do you do with that? Says Rabbi that noyhagen but tevel uke truma or utruma. It's amazing. Divrei Rabbi, the kohen. We believe the goy enough that this is truma, which means a non-Kohen cannot eat it. But we don't give him enough nemanus to say that the Kohen can go and eat it. A non-Kohen cannot eat it. As far as the Kohen is concerned, the Kohen has to have a chashash, as the Gemara will tell you what it is, and that's not even about whether he's trustworthy. That's because he's not knowledgeable. That what he gave is tevel, or a mixture of Trum and Tevel, as we'll see. And whenever you have a chashash, whether something is Trum or Tevel, remember, we already know these dinim. You have to tithe it, but you cannot tithe it from it. Because if it's Truma, you're doing nothing. And if it's a mixture of Trum and Tevel, then you might be taking mi ha-Truma shabai for the Tevel shabai, which doesn't work. So you have to be Toidem mi makemach. And lachatchila min amukav. Thank you. That is Rabbi. However, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Oimer Harei zu Truma Vadai. No, we don't have any fear. He has full-fledged nemanus. And this argument is going to express itself in two other scenarios, all based on the same logic, as we'll see. Case number two. Hoitzi lohem ma'aser rishon mitoich beisai. Same thing. The goy separated Truma, so he says. Afterwards, he separated. He goes ahead and he gives away. So what's the din? So by the way, there's no kedusha. Even a Yisrael can eat ma'aser rishon. So Rebbe holds it might be ma'aser rishon. The goy thinks it's ma'aser rishon, but it still might be tevel. Noihagen boy kid tevel uke ma'aser rishon divrei Rebbe. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, no, Vadai not Hevel, for sure not Hevel. Einoi tzarech lahafresh ela truma bilvad. In other words, even though it's Meiser Rishon Vadai, you still have to remove truma. You'll see in the Gemara soon why. What Rabbi holds, we don't even know if it's Meiser Rishon. It might be Meiser Rishon, it might be Tevel. No, it's Vadai Meiser Rishon that needs to have truma removed from it. And the third case, it's all the same, as we'll see in a moment. Meiser Sheni hoitzi lohen. Meiser Sheni mitoich beisoi. So here you have a guy who's selling produce and he's telling the customers, Chavra, this is Meiser Sheni. It's already Meiser Sheni, which would mean that if it's indeed Meiser Sheni, either the Jewish customer has to take it to Yerushalmi HaKodesh, or, right, you redeem it on money. If you're the owner, you add a chaimish and you take that and you redeem it on food in Yerushalayim and eat it there. So here again, Rabbi says we don't know. Noihagen ba kitevel uke Meiser Sheni divrei Rabbi, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer vadai Meiser Sheni, not tevel, but even though it's Meiser Sheni, you still have to remove from it. And we're going to go now with both Truma and Meiser Rishon, as we'll see in the Gemara. Atkan. So now we know what they say. Now, why does each one say what they say? Now the Gemara will explain. This is an Amoiram. Regarding all of these three arguments, there is a din. We know this din that you cannot be toida mimin al she'ena minoi. So if someone was toida mimin al she'ena minoi, let me tell you what that means. Okay, so I have apples and oranges. The guy has apples and oranges. Let's even say he knows the ratio of 2%. Let's say he even knows the din of min hamukaf. So what he did is that he removed from the apples for the oranges 2%. Since even post facto you cannot separate truma from one on another type, so those 2% of apples that he removed was ineffective. Not only is the remaining apples tevel, or he did it for the oranges, all of the oranges are tevel, it is also tevel as it was. Maybe that's what happened.
So the cases they're doing einaminai in all three cases. Is that correct?
In other words, when a guy gives me apples, he might have taken these apples exclusively for oranges.
So yeah, so he's taking it einaminai.
That's right.
That's in all three cases.
Yeah. In other words, in other words, what the point of Rabbi Yossi Barabun is, this is not a question of trustworthiness at all. It's a question of knowing the laws. He doesn't know the laws. He might have separated truma in a way where even b'di'evid, what he did is b'chlal not effective, and therefore this remained as it was tevel. However, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel does not have such a suspicion, because normally people are not toidim mimin al she'ena minoi. He's not saying that he's a big scholar. People are toidim from each type on itself, like organically. There's only one issue here. The one issue is that a guy might not know or does not know that there is a seder in how you have to tithe. And let's remember what we learned. We just spoke about this yesterday. Let's leave Bikurim on the side, because by Bikurim we learned yesterday there's a machlekes tanoim. But when it comes to all of the other tithings, right, Aviv, once not shibalin, once an item underwent a meruach, and if I separated something out of order, even though that separation is effective, but something that needed to be separated prior to it has to be separated from it. That's why Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that when it comes to Meiser Rishon, it's Meiser Rishon. It wasn't Mimin al She'ena Minoi, which would make a tevel. But maybe the goy separated Truma later, or not at all. So you have to take the Meiser Rishon, and aside of separating, like always, from the Meiser Rishon, Meiser Min HaMeiser, you have to also separate the percent, which is 2%, from what you received for Truma. Same thing he says with Meiser Sheni. Maybe the guy only separated Meiser Sheni. Maybe the guy separated Meiser Sheni, and then he did it on his own. But what you got, you still have to be mafresh from it, Truma and Meiser Rishon at Mamashvitz. Beautiful. Daf Lamed Beis Amid Beis. Now, the Mishnah gave us a machlekes.
Sorry, one more question. Are we buying specifically from the guy Reuven is getting specifically Meiser Rishon or Meiser Sheni, or is he getting product from which the guy said, I took Meiser Rishon?
The case of the Braisa was that the guy gifted it to a kohen and he gifted it to a Levi. He gave it. Now, Trumas Hanachri. So after we spoke about the Gemara is even going over the Machlokes here between Rabbi Yehuda regarding Neta Revoy, Kedem Revoy. The end of the Mishnah is based on the premise that Trumas Hanachri v'Hakuti, Trumas and Truma, it's all the way. All the way means it's Mamish Truma. Trumas Hanachri Medamas. If it falls into Chulin, and if someone eats it, I have to give a Chaimish, and Abshimin is poited. So now let's begin to analyze the Machlokes. We want to understand better the Shita of the Tana Rab Shimon. Amar Rab Zeira, that Amrit, I said initially in front of Rabbi Bohu in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that Ma Pligin means in what case do they argue? In what case do they argue? Look inside the top Pnei Moshe. Ma Pligin b'ma hu de Pligi. Where does Rab Shimon argue? In which he says, V'sfiro lake. The Ein Chayavin Oleh Chaimish. Let's keep on reading the Pnei Moshe. The Havamina, the initial understanding of Rab Shimon was that that's Dafke Betrumas Gornoi Shal Hanachri, which is that Rab Shimon holds Yesh Kinyan La'akum Lahafkia. It's not about his capacity of imbuing the product with bona fide Kedushas Truma. No. It's that Rab Shimon holds that a non-Jewish ownership in the land removes its Kedusha Mido'iraisa, which means that that Mido'iraisa, there is no obligation of tithing at all. Midrabanan, there is. Rab Shimon holds, like the Tanakama, that the Goy's separation is effective. But if the item itself only had a rabbinic obligation, so the truma is called a truma midrabanan, and this would fit, Chevre, with what we learned prior, that truma midrabanan is not midamas, and you're not chayiv chaimish, which also would mean that if there was a Jew, listen to what I'm saying, that's what Pnei Moshe is saying, if there was a Jew, the Jew grew the produce on Jewish land, the Jew grew the produce all the way to the Meruach, the Jew who was obligated to separate didn't. He sold his whole business to a goy. Now the goy owns it. Now the goy separates it. Even Rab Shimon would be moide that now that truma is midamas. Now you would be chayiv chaimish. That's what the Bnei Moshe is saying. That he understood that the reason why you're not chayiv is dafke, right? The second line at the top, betrumas gerone shal anochri, because since it came from the goyren of the nochri, so the item was already exempted biblically, according to Rab Shimon, that we are presuming now holds that a goy's ownership in the land removes the chiyuv, or that if the goy was the one that made the miruach, there is never a biblical obligation. No, but in the case where the item, where the chefza is mechuyev midaraisa to be tithed, even Rab Shimon would be moida that if the guy was the one that did it, even though he's not obligated to do it, it will be effective like the Tanakama. If it will be truma, it will be truma midaraisa, and truma midaraisa is midamas and chayv chamid. That was the havami. Now you get what the Gemara is saying. Ma pligin, where do they argue? Only betrumas garnoi, which would mean, according to Rab Zeira's initial understanding, that Rab Zeira, but in another case, where a Jew bought produce where a non-Jew bought produce from a Jew that did not tithe it. Okay. Now, a guy is not chayiv to, but the guy then tithed it. Rab Shimon would be moide that his truma designation, separation is just like a Jew's. Therefore, it's imbued with such a level of kedusha that it's midabas and yachayv chaimish. That's the way Rab Zeira understood it, because by him it was very simple. If it's truma midoraisa, midamas v'chayv chaimish. For you to say eina midamas eina chayv chaimish must be because it's only midrabanan. However, Omar, if Rab Zeira is the one saying the story, Rab Zeira says that when I said that to Rabbi Bo, you know what he told me? And he told me, B'Shem Rabbi Yechanan. It's also amazing, just to understand how it worked. He was having this conversation, right? B'Shem Rabbi Yechanan. I'm sorry. Yeah. That's the Rabbi Ze'eda is saying this is what I understood from Rabbi Yechanan. So Rabbi Bo corrected him and he told him, no, that Amar Li Rabbi Bo b'shem Rabbi Yechanan. No. He machlekes even where vadai the produce is chayiv to be tithed mida oiraisa. It's not like Rab Shimon, the Tana Rab Shimon is saying, well, a goy cannot. He could, and he does it, and it's effective. It's effective to the point that it's misak in the tevel. Nevertheless, it's not midamas. But the kasha is mimanavshach. And when he said that, the kasha al de Rab Shimon, how can that be? In other words, if you're telling me that even in a case where the goydin was from a Jew, so l'kula alma, there's no other machlekes you can bring into the chalant over here to explain why there's no chiyuv. There is a chiyuv. And yet you're saying trumas and truma. You're not saying it's not truma. You're saying trumas and truma. Is a raya? Truma, it must be that it's poited tivli dvar toira. If it's such a truma that the remaining is allowed to be eaten, how could it be that still you're going to tell me that it's not midamas? Still, you're not chayiv choimish. How can that be? To which the Gemara answers, it could be. A Jew asking with a question, V'chi kachim einam toira. Right, the Mishnah, don't forget the beauty of the Mishnah where Rabbeinu HaKadosh already linked it to the fact that a non-Jew who consecrates a chulin animal, that even lemizbeach, it has kedushas mizbeach. Don't you see that? Don't you know that a goy who is sanctifying an animal, it becomes holy midoiraisa, and nevertheless, the halacha of these animals midoiraisa is of a lesser restriction. Mamish, Rab Shimon poited. Now, poited doesn't mean it's not holy. No, it could be brought on the Mizbeach. So where is there an area in which you can treat it not on the same level as a Masechta Zvachim? Utanina Taman, we learned in the Mishnah in Zvachim, Kachei Agoyim, animals that were consecrated by non-Jews. Both when it comes to the din of Pigul, which would mean that let's go with the Kohen who does the Avodah during any one of the four primary Avodas, Shchita, Kabbalah, Hoilacha, and Zrika. If he had a machsheves chutz lizman exclusively, or if actually some of the carbon was not put on the mizbeach in its appropriate time, or not eaten in its appropriate time, we call that noiser, or if the kachim, that animal became tamei. These are all three scenarios where the Torah writes that if someone then goes ahead and eats it, they're chayiv kares, right? Nevertheless, state in the Mishnah that Kachei Hagoyim ein chayavin aleya mishum pigol v'noiser v'tamei. Wow. And another din, that we have a din of chitas chutz. V'hashoichatan b'chutz, if someone slaughters this animal outside the azara, l'shem the oibishter, there's a, right? I think chayv misa b'dei shamayim, or maybe chayv kares. It's a terrible violation. Nevertheless, the halacha is that even though the carbon designated by the goy is a designated carbon, it's imbued with kedusha, but it doesn't have the same height, the same level, and you're going to be potter. And we're going dafka with the girsa divrei Rabbi Shimon. However, Rabbi Yossi is machayev because Rabbi Yossi memanavshach. Is it holy or is it not holy? If it's holy biblically, then how can you exempt it from? So it's just like we find, and the Mishnah links it. Just like we find when it comes to kachim, that you can have something that's mikudesh midoiraisa, but it has somehow a lesser degree of kedusha. Same, that's the whole chiddush of Rab Shimon, that even though it's truma midoiraisa, even where there is a chiyuv midoiraisa, and it's pointed the rest from tevel midoiraisa, nevertheless, eina medamas. Because the goy's designation cannot imbue it with the same height of the level of kedusha. Amazing. And now, let's just know what Rab Shimon says. And like we spoke when we learned the Mishnah, see, the words of Rab Shimon is Rab Shimon poited. The words pater is the opposite of chayiv. Pater and chayiv is when it comes to when it comes to a financial obligation, but not when it comes to midamas or ene midamas. The lashon there is not pater or chayiv, either midamas or ene midamas. Rab Shimon does not say ene midamas. So the Gemara says that Hava Boin Meimar, that when the yeshiva students, when the Bnei Yeshiva learned this, they said that Mapligin, where does Rab Shimon argue? Only on the Muah, only on the Chaimish. They said, but by the Mu'aloi, the very fact that the Mishnah does not say Rab Shimon pointed ve'ena medamas, he doesn't say that. So they understood he's only arguing for some reason on the din of a Chaimish. However, we found later a Braisa that elaborates that says he hado. The Braisa writes both. The Braisa probably on the Seder, right? Because the Tanakama says trumas hanochli midamas v'chayov en choimish. Rab Shimon oimer einoi midamas upater. So now that we know that from a Braisa, why did the Mishnah only say pater? The Gemara doesn't ask, but at least we know what is the Shita of Rab Shimon, and on that we say Hadron Allah Chatoirim Kishus, that God willing we're coming back to you, and right that Maskifin Aschalta with the Siyum. Let's begin. We have a few minutes. The new 4th chapter. We're going back to the smaller dafim again, and we have more time to say Birchas HaShachar B'Kavana. We're starting going forward 6:15. Now like this. Again, we learned this Mishnah before. Aviv, let me go back to it because you had good questions on this, and Rabbi Mendel, I hope will have clarity with what you mentioned before. If a person has kavana to separate the minimal amount in order to exempt this pile from tevel, that post facto will be effective even if this person is giving way less than the minimum rabbinic obligation. But if when a person is separating truma, the person is kavana, his intention is to separate whether it's 1 in 40, 1 in 50, 1 in 60, even if he doesn't do it in one go, we don't say now everything is exempted, and once everything is exempted, you can never be toidim from it. We don't say that. We say that the whole pile will only be exempted when he will do what he intended to do. And that's exactly the case of the Mishnah, which is hamafresh mixas truma or maisris. You separated. Let me just give the mashal. Look inside the Mara folder, right in the beginning of the new Perek. Hamafresh mixas truma sumaisris kigoyin. Example. That's hoyloi meya soin. You have 100 son, and they're all tevel. And v'hoitzi mehen. Really, you're aiming to take off 2. 2 from 100 is the 2%. Echad mechamish. Today on Wednesday, you take off 1 saw of truma. But when you take off the 1 saw, that's important. Ubedatoi. You right away have in mind lahafresh adayin ashar. So number one, you're chayiv to take off the other one. Problem is, the question is, are you allowed to take off the other saw from this pile? So the Tana Kama holds that yes, you could. Let's keep on reading the Marafulda. You can take it off from this pile. That why? And why not? Let me go to the why now. Why not? Who? Because when I took off 1, half of the pile is already mesukin. Why don't we say that when I remove the second saw, I'm not removing it from the tevel? Truma can only be removed from tevel. Maybe I'm removing it from the mesukin, heart mesukin. We don't say that. The hatevel, we say the hatevel hu sheyale. That what came in your hand, the second saw, is only tevel. Let's read it inside. Moitzi mimenu truma olav. But here the Tanakama says a beautiful chiddush. Avaloi l'makem acher. Avaloi l'makem acher. What's l'makem acher? Aviv. Look inside the second marafulda. Im yesh lemeya soin acherim shel tevel. Guys, halt up. I removed 1 saw from pile 1. Okay. Now I want to take from this pile 1. I want to take from it truma. Minamukav l'makem acher. Im yesh lemeya soin acherim shel tevel eino yochel lahafresh aleim me'elu shahoitzi mixas trumasan. Not even 1 saw. Gurnished. Why? Because the lagabe acherim, if we are looking at this one for another, we say, no, you can't touch this one. Because talinan means we are afraid you're hanging. It might be Dilma min shekfar niskanu moitzelei. Maybe you took it from the 50 that was rectified. Don't forget, you took off 1. 1 is masaken 50. You can never take truma from something that's no longer tevel. So the Tanakama differentiates. From the pile for the pile, you can do step number 2. From this pile for another pile, you have to be chayish that you're taking it from the wrong ones. However, our Mishnah only brings one other opinion, which is Rabbi Meir. He goes, Mimanavshach. Could you say halachically, couldn't you presume that you're taking it from the tevel? Which you could. So if you can presume it for it, you can presume it for something else. Rav Meir Oimer af moitzi hu l'makem acher trumas u'maisres. We're lenient all the way. In contrast to the Tana Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov that the Gemara will bring in a Brais on Daf Lamed Daled, he also says we have to be consistent, but he goes l'chumra. He writes over there, we quoted this before, that no, you can never be toidim from the pile, not even for himself. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that Eini moitzi loy olav v'loy al makam acher. These are the three opinions, two in the Mishnah, one in the Braisa, to be continued.